everyone. Welcome to another Americans for Limited Government live stream. Welcome, Rick. It's good to have you back on. I'm happy you're here. A lot has happened just in the last 24 hours here in Washington. It looks like Democrats are just having the worst week of the year. As far as I can see, they've had a lot of setbacks in the last 24 hours. So I'll just let you start with what I think is the biggest setback. President Biden put out a written statement late last night saying that his Build Back Broke bill is most likely not going to go anywhere before the end of the year. So he's trying to remain hopeful that it could happen in January. But tell me what has been happening in the last 48 hours or so here.
Well, the Democrats don't have the votes. And as a result of not having the votes for reconciliation, they are having to retrench. One of the things that's happened, there's a couple of disastrous things that have happened for the Democrats from a political standpoint that changed the equation. One is the inflation rate. The inflation is going wild, and Joe Manchin in particular is very much aware of that. He's more of an old school LBJ Democrat. He's lived long enough to remember when inflation was running wild in the country, and so he is sitting there saying, "Wait a second. We cannot spend more money now. This is the wrong time." He's not actually offering a philosophical argument against the provisions of the Biden bill. Instead, he's saying timing's off. This would be the worst thing we could possibly do for the country. And this is the wrong time to do these programs. It's the wrong program for the wrong economic part of the economic cycle. And so, interestingly, something that you and I don't have any control over, which is the inflation rate, has actually been probably the number one thing that's caused Joe Manchin to basically say, we're not doing this. Now, that doesn't mean that he supports everything within that reconciliation bill. What it means is what he's using as the cudgel to say no is the inflation rate. And what that means is if the inflation rate goes down over the next 6 months, which is possible, if it goes down over the next 6 months due to actions by the Federal Reserve or there's not a lot of helicopter money being shipped around the country. At that point, if that argument goes away, I don't know what happens with this bill. So right now, the important thing is the bill's not going to pass before the end of the year. I think the Democrats are going to repackage it. They're going to attempt to push what they see are the things that people like in that bill and push them out there pretty strongly, particularly into West Virginia, and to try to create a counter pressure on Joe Biden or on Joe Manchin to support the bill later on next year. And so I think that's where it's going. So temporarily that bill's on the shelf, but the Democrats aren't going to give up on it because they know if they get that bill, they will have achieved generational transformation of our country. And that's what they're aiming for.
Isn't sort of one of the truisms that you hear here in Washington is that, next year it will be midterm elections. We have all these vulnerable Democrats in the House and Senate who will be up for re-election in the fall. So don't you always hear they don't want to take any hard votes just before an election so that the window to get through their radical agenda is going to close now at the end of this year? Or am I being too optimistic? I always thought that these vulnerables are not going to want to vote on something that radical close.
Well, there's two things. There's two things that can happen. And that is a truism. It certainly applies to Republicans. I'm not sure it applies to Democrats. Let me explain why. Your midterm elections are all about voter turnout. The Democrats' base is very, very liberal. So what they're saying is they want that base to come out. If they don't deliver for that base, the base will be depressed and they will be guaranteed to lose. So the question the political operatives have is how do they incite their base? How do they keep their promises to their base at a time when and keep their base willing to fight for them to maintain control of the House and the Senate? And the answer is The only way they do that is by trying to pass radical agenda items. And that's the answer. So that's what they're going to continue to do. The second piece of this that people don't realize is that Democrats in particular, once they figure it out that they're going to lose anyway, at that point, they have very few reasons not to vote for the most radical of radical plans. Because if you already know you're going to lose, then all of the next jobs, the Democratic side, are constituencies that are getting taken care of by the Build Back Better plan. So so effectively, all those constituencies that are lobbying you for it are the ones you're going to be going to for a job in January of 2023. And so there's a lot of pressure from that standpoint to be able to go and support those who you believe will be your employer or signing you to consulting contracts after you lose. So it's a really dicey kind of hard time for politically. That's why I think the Democrats are going to take at least 2 more runs at it because they're hoping that the politics will change. And lastly, very simply, if inflation tames a little bit, if some of the stuff Federal Reserve is doing helps tame inflation, and Manchin's primary concern goes away, at that point, he may be willing to do a couple of tweaks to it, small amendments, and make it so they can and pass it. See, that's the piece of it we don't know. We don't know what his real objections are.
Rick, in President Biden's written statement from last night, he urged Democrats to press forward with election reform legislation. I'm reading this from the Hill article that's on the screen there. He was calling for progress, quote, as soon as possible. Republicans had blocked efforts by Democrats to pass election reform bills and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Democrats would likely need to alter the legislation filibuster in order to get any legislation passed, though Biden's statement does not mention the filibuster. So there's a lot to pack in there. Biden is trying to pivot off of Build Back Better and say, but we have a winning agenda. Let's look at what we Republicans call the steal the vote bill. And then I'll have you explain what exactly that would do. But then he also, the reporter mentions this whole filibuster thing. Explain what's going on there.
Well, the election reform law can't be done under the budget reconciliation. No election laws can be done under budget reconciliation. And as a result, they have to stand to the normal test of passing, how you pass a bill in the Senate, and that has to get 60 votes. And that's how you invoke cloture on a filibuster. And so the Democrats have been hoping that they would be able to break the filibuster on the election law by doing a carve out for election laws under the filibuster rules. And all it would take would be 51 votes to alter the Senate rules to do that. And so that was the out they were trying to go for, is to say, well, just on election rules, we're going to change the number of votes needed to pass them. And Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona has made it absolutely clear she's not busting the filibuster. And as a result, and she reiterated this in the wake of Biden's statement last night. And if they can't do it with 51 votes, they don't have the votes. That's if they need 60, they don't have the votes, and that's their problem. Here's what in a nutshell, here's what the bill does. It has a lot of components, but the most egregious ones are it takes away redistricting from the states and puts it all in the Justice Department. So the Justice Department would be writing your congressional districts. So imagine how much fun that would be with a Biden Justice Department doing that. Any changes in election laws would have to be approved by the Justice Department. That would include even if you wanted to put where you would put ballot drop boxes, where your precincts would have to be for voting purposes in person. It would down to the most minute details. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division would have control over that. And so it's effectively akin to giving Stacey Abrams control over the elections nationwide. In fact, when you look at radical, Stacey Abrams is a moderate compared to the people who are running the DOJ Civil Rights Division. So that's what you'd be looking at. They'd control the redistricting and they'd control the all of the election laws in the nation. They'd eliminate voter identification with this requirements, and you'd see a whole lot more vote by mail with a whole lot less security that the ballots were actually being cast by the people who purported to be casting them.
So the bottom line then, Rick, with this steal the election or vote rigging bill the Democrats want to pivot to, is the aim of it is to give Democrats permanent majorities in the House, the Senate, and the White House. I mean, this is a complete takeover of government for like the foreseeable future, right?
As Joe Biden said the other day, it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes.
Right.
That's what he told Democratic activists just this week. So I'm going to believe him when he says that. I don't do that often, but when somebody gets up and says something that outrageous, you look at it and you say, well, maybe he slipped up and inadvertently told the truth. And that's what this voting bill that they've been trying to push through does. It makes it so that the Democrats in the Department of Justice are the arbiters over all the elections nationwide, and as a result, they would be the ones who'd be drawing the districts. They'd be basically deciding what the chess pieces on the board were going to be, and then they would go off and get to move the chess pieces. And essentially, it's like playing checkers, where the other side gets to get a queen every single time, or king rather. They get a king every single time they move their checker once, whereas you have to go all the way to the end of the board and to get a king. It's essentially that's the difference. They would so overweight the election and put a thumb on the scale that, quite honestly, fair and honest elections would be forever jeopardized.
So the Senate Democrats met yesterday just before President Biden released his statement, and they're very frustrated, as you can imagine. One Democratic senator was quoted in a Politico article. The person remained anonymous. A 2-week cooling off would not be the worst thing. So they're trying to put the best spin on this to say, well, none of it's dead. It's just a kind of cooling off period. I mean, I think that's insane. Like, what do you think? In 2 weeks, inflation is going to be under control? I mean, I think it's ridiculous. The House Progressive Caucus leader, Pramila Jayapal, said she spoke to Biden on Thursday and conveyed that she wants the Senate to stay in D.C. and keep working through the holidays. Meanwhile, senators are preparing to jet home after finishing work on some of Biden's nominees, given their stubborn impasse. And this is what the House says, Rick. The House did our work, and now it's time for the Senate to do theirs. They must stay in session until Build Back Better is passed. I mean, obviously, that's like crazy talk. The Senate isn't going to stay and work over the holidays.
Well, they've actually stayed later than most people expected them to already. And, if this was about negotiating a couple of points between the House and the Senate to come up with a piece of legislation, her suggestion might make sense. But what she's actually suggesting is that the Senate should be effectively put in a room and not allowed to come out, with no food being provided until they agree with the House. And the Senate actually does believe they're a separate, independent body from the House of Representatives. And they particularly don't take it kindly when the House members try to tell them how to do their business. All in all, interesting what she says, but that's all about her fundraising. It has nothing to do with getting anything done.
And Rick, the other thing that happened just yesterday as well, the Senate parliamentarian made a ruling, the third one. The Democrats keep coming back at this, trying to slip in amnesty for 6.5 million illegal aliens in this country. They keep trying to shove that into their Build Back Broke bill. And for the third time, the parliamentarian said no. And the parliamentarian is appointed by the Senate Majority Leader, so presumably she's sort of sympathetic towards them, but she is, to her credit, seems to be following what the rules and what the laws are.
Yeah, they are attempting to pass. Essentially, her point is this isn't a minor change. This is passing major
Yeah.
legislation without a real budgetary rationale. And so while she would allow, for instance, Green New Deal things to be funded, different ideas to be funded under the budget reconciliation bill, because that's actually funding. The changing election laws is just it's different than an appropriations bill, and so it doesn't really fit at all. And because it's actually changing law, it's changing existing law rather than funding, which is what a funding bill would do, funding different aspects of the law and creating grants that can be handed out under guise of regulatory actions taken based upon law that already has passed. So that's kind of the difference. And so they keep trying, but there's no way that the any kind of immigration law fits anywhere near a budget reconciliation. And once again, they're desperate to try to get something done that where they don't need to get 60 votes. And and that's why what Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin said in the past about the filibuster is so important, because if they were able to get this stuff done with 51 votes, the 50 Democrats in the Senate and Kamala Harris, you would see mass amnesty. You would see the 1.7 trillion-dollar bill would be back to 3.5. And you'd see all sorts of interesting things and really bad things happen for the country. But fortunately, they've held firm, and they're saying no, no filibuster increase. No, we're not getting rid of the filibuster. So they're not able to do things like change the makeup of the Supreme Court, impact the Supreme Court, which is something they've talked about. So all in all, it's we've been pretty frustrated by the filibuster when the Republicans were in control, because the Democrats have basically stopped everything through filibuster. But you get right down to it. Now they're eating from the same poison tree, and it's kind of fun to see them squirming around on the floor a little bit, because it drives you nuts. The fact the Senate can't do stuff, but you understand why when you're in the minority, and it frustrates you when you're in the majority.
And Rick, we had a comment earlier from a viewer saying that, Democrats couldn't get elected dog catcher right now. And I think the point there is that the poll numbers for Joe Biden specifically, and then just the sort of Democrat brand, is just horrible right now. I mean, I don't know that it's ever been worse for them.
Yeah, I used to always say that the Democrats couldn't drop below 43%. That was kind of their low, and they're well below 43%, particularly Biden. But the overall brand they're upside down, and Republicans win overwhelmingly in elections if the generic ballot in question, which means they ask the public, if you had to choose, would you prefer a Republican or a Democrat to be your member of Congress? And somebody says, if that turns out to be 50-50, the Republicans win overwhelmingly, because many of the Democrat districts are very condensed in terms of having 90-10 splits in them. And the rest of the districts in the country are much more evenly split. As a result, if you're 50-50 nationwide, that means in those districts that aren't compact 90-10, you're actually leading. And so Republicans win big if it's 50-50. The fact that Republicans in the last generic ballot I saw are up by 9 points is certainly unprecedented in my lifetime.
Well, Rick, I want to thank you for coming on with us today. Did you know, by the way, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when we look at the numbers of people who are watching our ALG live streams, every time you're on, the numbers are higher. So I think that our followers, our friends and supporters out there really do like hearing your insights and your analysis, just because you've been around this town for so many years. You've been a part of the executive branch, and you just have a lot of wisdom and experience that brings a lot of light to these issues. So thank you. I really
Well, I
appreciate
appreciate
that.
that. And, if we don't, if for anybody who's out there, you don't see us between then and now, I'll be on. But if you don't catch one of these things between then and now, have a Merry Christmas. This is it gives us a chance to reflect on what's important. And, God sending Christ, our Lord, our Savior to earth, to reunite us in spite of our sin, is the single most important event in human history, right up there with the resurrection on Easter Sunday. And so those two events are the single two most important events in human history. And let's celebrate it. Let's remember it. Let's just praise God for the next couple of weeks, and just we're going to stay plugging away and doing the politics, but we also have to keep our eyes on on what matters in the ultimate universe, and that is that relationship with God. So Merry Christmas, and celebrate, and tell people why Christ being born matters.
Thank you, Rick, and Merry Christmas, everyone. I think we'll be back on next week, but
We will be, but not everybody,
Yes.
not all the same people will be.
Exactly.
And when I get really worked up about Christmas, it'll be next week. So if you want to get the Christmas sermon, just come in next week, okay?
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time on an Americans for Limited Government live stream.